and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. It's so great to see so many familiar faces, returning faces. Really pleased to see you here tonight. I don't think we need to sell the event too much. I think the writers, their reputation really speaks for itself. Ivan, you've written several novels. You are at Wits, the head of the creative writing department. You're a writer at large, if we can call it that. Justin, you don't need any introduction, right? You've had so many years of experience as a travel writer, photographer, getaways, editor, right? And you're someone who is really at the forefront, taking the pulse of writing and travel writing, and you're also a novelist, right? So you both wear many different hats. Before we start talking about the books themselves, what are you busying yourself with at the moment, Ivan and Justin?
I should probably correct one thing, which is I'm not the head of the creative writing department. I am attached to the department as a distinguished professor, but I'm not the head. At the moment, I'm busying myself with promoting this book, mainly. But
the business of performance arts.
Yes, exactly. On the writing side, I have a couple of writing projects, ongoing projects. I'm in the middle of a novel, or I think I'm in the middle of a novel. I think it's a novel. And then I have, I would say, 2 or 3 projects at different stages. That's the usual way that I work, with things overlapping. If you don't get one project going while you're finishing off the one that you're really focused on, you have this moment of getting stuck and having to sort of start from scratch, as it were. So I try to get several things rolling at the same time, and then once this moment is over, try and find the project that feels most urgent and push that through. And I think that's a novel.
And Justin?
Yeah, Jonathan, I'm writing a novel series, so I've just number 2 has just come out, The Wolf Hunt. Second World War, set in Simonstown and Cape Town, Royal Navy, adventure style, trying to capture the spirit of the Cape in the 1940s. That's what the novels do. The second one has just come out. It's actually being launched next week in Johannesburg for the first time. I'm working on number 3. It's currently with my publishers in the UK, and that is set in North Africa, in Egypt, Battle of Tobruk and El Alamein. So it's a series. That's part 2. That's part 3, and I'm starting to tinker with number 4, which is Malta and the convoys to Malta in 1942. So those are novel projects I'm working on. I'm also working on an epic apocalyptic poem about South Africa that is a long, slow work in progress that I don't want to talk too much about now.
Can you ever finish an apocalyptic poem about South Africa?
No. I suppose it's a career move. But yeah, so those are the 2 main projects that I'm working on.
Yeah. And you're sleeping, I hope, in between.
Yeah, I do get a bit of sleep. Not much.
Justin, to stay with you, as an introduction to what we're going to talk about tonight, space and place, writing process, genre, form, things like that. The very first, would you call it the first chapter or an introduction to place, is a really, really beautiful essay that speaks about the spirit of place. Can you tell us more about that and this idea of the genus loci, right, and why this was germane to your project?
Yeah, I suppose even the title, Place, is really a shorthand for spirit of place. And what I wanted to do in the novel was to travel to South African landscapes that, and try to look at the landscape through the eyes of great South African authors, and also through the eyes of their characters. And in a sense, I understood these 9 authors, from Olive Schreiner through to J.M. Coetzee, to be almost the genii loci of these places. So the genius loci, in terms of where the word comes from, it's from ancient Rome, where it was believed that a house or a road or a temple would have a spirit attached to it, and that was the genius loci. That notion was picked up and embellished by the Romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge, etc., who looked at places like the Lake Districts through the eyes of that idea of spirit of place. I wouldn't apply that to the South African landscape. And so what I speak about in the introduction is to try and find South African locations that have been elevated, invigorated, recast in fiction in the most astonishing, beautiful, evocative way. And perhaps the author that most embodies that idea is, for me at least, is Stephen Watson and his evocations of the Cederberg. And walking the Cederberg trails with his poems in my backpack was a way, I felt was a way of paying tribute to him as this, in my eyes anyway, the spirit of the Cederberg.
You've mentioned walking there, which is very important to your project, Ivan. The near north, of course, is a return in not quite non-fiction, not quite essay, not quite straightforward fiction or short story to Johannesburg. You've written about Johannesburg before, particularly I'm thinking of Portrait with Keys. This is a return many years later, and you've entitled the book The Near North. Which north are you talking about in the book? And in terms of a geography or an itinerary for the reader, how do you think the reader is supposed to orient him or herself in entering this landscape with you as a kind of flaneur or a walker?
Well, I could start by saying a little bit about Portrait with Keys, which was set in the eastern suburbs of Johannesburg, in Troyville mainly, Troyville and Kensington, and set in the period of the sort of transformation. So most of the pieces were written around the early 90s. And that was an attempt to understand that part of the city as a kind of, as a microcosm in a way of larger social change. So I felt that period was so difficult to get a handle on what was happening because our society was changing so quickly and in such dramatic ways. And so I wrote a book which is really about my neighborhood, to understand that in a small way. About 10 years ago, I moved to the north of Johannesburg, to the northern suburbs, and was more or less compelled to move. I went kicking and screaming in some ways. And I've ended up living in Riviera, which is actually just on the northern side of the mythical boundary between the northern suburbs and the rest of Joburg. And living in that, what was for me is a relatively new environment, new suburbs, looking around there, trying to orient myself, actually feeling quite disoriented, having spent 30 years in other parts of the city. I felt when I began to write about that area and think about it, I had to locate it for myself. And I had begun to think of the distant parts of Johannesburg as the far north, because the city has kind of spilled northwards over the last decades. And so areas like Fourways and Honeydew, which used to be in the countryside, are now suburban. And in contrast to that far north, I began to think of my area, which is really the old northern suburbs, as the near north. And there's a play there on the north of the city that's also close to me, and that I can get close to through my writing. This kind of connection that Justin's talking about. So, and then there's also a play on the global north, suggesting in some ways that that north, that global north is also close to us in certain parts of our society, and perhaps especially in that area of Johannesburg.
You've provided us with quite a kaleidoscopic answer. You've touched on several things, the idea of transition. We seem as a country to be in a state of perpetual transition recently, right? With a very uncertain future, and many people find it quite apocalyptic You know, the idea of uncertainty, boundaries constantly being crossed, a state of dislocation. Both of you write about location, locale, place, space in an extremely intimate way. This is a question for you first, Justin, and then for you, Ivan. This question of intimacy and distance, how close do you feel to be a good travel writer that is convincing and that makes the reader want to know more about a place? How close do you have to physically, geographically be to a place, and imaginatively, how broad should you look? What kind of elements should you bring in to be a good travel writer?
There are two aspects to that question, and the one would be, I wear two very different hats, and the one is the travel journalist hat, and the other is the travel writing hat. For travel journalism is much more smash and grab. You've got to get in fast, get the story relatively fast, and get out fast.
Is the slower kind of process, is it more rewarding for you, or have you learned to love both?
I do love both. I do like the arrive in a strange country and try and grab it in a very short space of time. That's a wonderful challenge to have. It's extremely exciting and invigorating, but you're never going to be able to delve deeply. So for travel writing, for a book like Place, which took me 15 years to write, so it's a long, slow burn.
That's very much a labour of love.
That is, so that's going to immerse yourself in a landscape for a long time. Go and spend a few weeks in the Kruger Park or in the Waterberg or wherever, and take the author with you. So have in your backpack all the texts that you need for that author in that landscape. If you're doing Herman Charles Bosman in the Marika, you've got a big backpack of books. And it's trying to, and it's also a bit about falling in love with that landscape. So all 9 landscapes in this book are places that I really am passionately care about tremendously, and that I've been back to many times in my career. So all of these landscapes, the Kruger Park for Drockel the Bushveld, or the Waterberg for Eugene Marais, or Neisner Forest for Darlene Mathieu, are places that I would have been many times in my career as a travel writer, as a travel journalist, but this was the opportunity to go and sink deeper shafts, spend more time, write a lot. So sit under a tree for an afternoon and try to capture the spirit of place. And that's a huge luxury which you don't necessarily have as a journalist.
And I would say as a novelist as well, because you just generally don't have years and years to work on a book, right? Your process, I guess it's quite different than many other writers in the sense that you work with the idea of collage, and you play a lot. You also write in a very visual way. I want to ask you about your relationship to looking, particularly in terms of a photographic kind of a way of seeing, and then writing about a city like Johannesburg, which could be quite overwhelming in its spaces. How do you write about a landscape in an intimate way that really gives you the grain of a place?
Well, I could perhaps say something about the photographic connection. First of all, I've worked over the years with a lot of visual artists and with photographers specifically, and writing works that are connected to their visual work but not directly about them. So not commentaries about them, but work that comes into existence kind of in relation to them, with their work somehow in the corner of my eye. And in that process, which has been over 20 years or so or more, I've learned a lot about looking, about what it takes to make a photograph, to find a photograph, and the virtues of patience, for instance, and the virtues of returning to places. And this is something that you were just touching on, that you see something different when you go back. And I've worked with photographers who obsessively returned to the same places, and found something different in each of those explorations. So that has filtered into my own way of working, that it's slow, and it's in some senses repetitive. It's partly about that return. Getting close, how do you get close as a writer? I think to a space like Johannesburg, you get out of the car for one thing. And that's not always sensible. It's not a walking city, but I've made it a bit of a mission, sometimes to my own detriment, to try and walk. Following in the tradition of the many writers over centuries who have walked as a way of getting close to where they are, as you do. And so I get out of the car, I walk, and in that way you get close to the place, you get close to people, you open yourself to certain kinds of engagement which you simply don't have if you're driving. And then you keep your eyes open. You try and actually look at what's there. And my own process involves lots of walking, lots of looking around, and then writing afterwards. But unlike Justin, who has to often has to write about it and process it quite quickly, I have the luxury of keeping those notes and then allowing the form of the book to emerge over a very long period.
I'm just going to stay with you for a second, Ivan. You've spoken about this collection of fragments and impressions. It's one thing to look at something and to take it in and to store it as a kind of a visual memory or as an object that you take on. But when you have to make writing out of it, writing that by the nature of it inevitably does seek to make sense, right? To order things. What kind of a process does that look like? And when you are gathering fragments, how do you decide what is going to be useful and valuable and what is just detritus or flotsam and jetsam and stuff that you can just toss aside? Or is everything valuable?
No, there is a fair amount of wastage, things that you can't use. I'm not sure that anything that you gather as an artist, as a writer or a photographer for that matter, is ever wasted, right? In some senses, you're making something of the world, whatever you do. I think of it as a luxury of having, keeping things. So it doesn't matter that much to me whether it feels immediately meaningful or immediately significant. I might have some encounter and write it down, draft it, and then just keep it. And wait for the moment at which a form appears when I'm working on something that attracts that material. And that's, I suppose, a process that you have to trust it. You have to trust that that the order will emerge rather than it's something that you can impose from the beginning. So if you ask about how you create order, I do it through actually making a mess and having kind of a fairly chaotic process, and waiting for the right moment at which things start to hang together.
I really love this idea of inversion and an inverted process, because writing sometimes is chaotic. Justin, you know from your travels that things don't always work out. With this book, did you set out very explicitly and specifically to say, okay, I'm going in with a brief, I'm going to write 9 essays about place, and that's going to be the plan? Or did it emerge sort of organically and you thought of more landscapes as you went along? What was your process like?
Yeah, it actually started in 2008. I was sent on an assignment to the Mariko to do a story on Herman Charles Bosman. And I took my mother along because her brother was Ace Kricher, who had been a close friend of Herman Charles Bosman in the 1940s in Johannesburg. And the two of them were sparring partners, and there were lots of stories about those two characters. And so having my mother along in the car and her recounting Ace's accounts of Herman was just a wonderful connection to have. And so that trip with my mom in the car, talking about Bosman, driving through that landscape and visiting the spaces of Bosman's wonderful characters and Oomskalk Lawrence's environment sparked the idea of building that into something a lot bigger. and that then sparked the idea of let's expand this to other South African authors, and then I thought let's expand this to African authors, and then so I had a whole lot of projects around this that were running at the same time. I went to Kenya and I went to Nairobi and I looked at Karen Blixen's Out of Africa environment, and then I went to Rwanda and I went looking for the gorillas, and I went to Diane Fossey's camp, and I thought, okay, that'll be a chapter. And then I was looking at sort of the Sahara and Paul Bowles, and then I thought maybe I'm going to go to Gaborone and do McCall Smith, and then I thought I'll go to Maputo and do Henning Michael.
Very, very, very ambitious.
Yeah, all right. So, and then I had to start tailoring it back and looking at South Africans. And I thought, okay, let's limit it to South Africans so that the project doesn't take 25 years, and let's also limit it to a number of very diverse landscapes. So I had to knock if I'm going to do Coetzee and Olive Schreiner, that knocks out all the other Karoo writers. So out goes Eve Palmer, out goes Pauline Smith, out goes Etienne van Heerden, because the Karoo is then oversubscribed. And then you take one from the Bushveld and one from the Lowveld and one sort of Drakensberg and one Wild Coast, and that got me to my 9 writers. So yes, it was an organic process, and yes, it was way more ambitious than initially, and there were a lot of great stories that were culled, and maybe at some point there's another book. If Ivan can keep writing about Johannesburg for a career, I can probably keep going with this for a career. Just about interesting what you were saying about Herman, you were implying about David Goldblatt working with his photographs and writing a response to them. And of course, David Goldblatt is writing a response to Herman Charles Bosman. So it's almost, he's taken Herman Charles Bosman's stories and turned them into photographs, and you've taken Goldblatt's photographs and turning them back into stories. It's an interesting organic process that was happening there.
Yeah.
Digression.
No, that's an interesting connection. I mean, it was always fascinating to me how Goldblatt, when he was asked about his influences, he very often mentioned writers. Yeah. I mean, he had the I suppose, more obvious photographic influences, rather than Walker Evans and so on. But he often spoke about Gordimer, Bosman, Barney Simon. You know, he mentioned he had a sort of pantheon of literary writers. Yeah. And he mentioned them as influences.
Yeah.
Ivan, if we can stay with you, this is a profoundly personal book. I know I've told you that as much. It's broad in some instances, but it's very personal, it's intimate. It covers many different forms of loss and a sense of melancholy. A 2-part question. The first one is about the afterlives of the city, right? In terms of imagining more than just a Joburg with a history, you know, the mining, the landlords, different parts, a city that constantly seems to be reimagining itself, right? How do you respond to that as a writer? And then the second part is this idea of death, dying, decay, as the city remakes itself. How do you work with that, and how do you reflect that in your writing and in your prose?
Johannesburg, and it's challenging to write about. It's also incredibly interesting city to live in. I suppose it's easy as a writer to become complacent to a certain extent and feel that you know your territory, right? You have an array of material and an array of knowledge, specialized knowledges of the city that you can draw on. And when you live in a place that's remaking itself and changing rapidly, you have to kind of think on your feet, and you have to start changing your own sense of what's happening.
You've literally got to think on your feet and keep walking, as you mentioned.
Exactly. God forbid you should stand still. But yeah, so it's, initially, I guess when Johannesburg began to change, and I felt myself as a writer displaced from my familiar city, from the inner city, from Hillbrow, from the and then increasingly from the suburbs, the immediate inner city suburbs around the kind of urban area, I felt quite threatened, as I think a lot of people did. I felt I'd been displaced. And I guess I had to learn that, to live with that and work with it and take it as some kind of challenge and some kind of a possibility rather than simply something that's being lost. And also understanding Johannesburg is always rising and falling at the same time, depending on where you are. It's that kind of place. Some people think it's collapsing, other people think it's booming, and it really depends on where you locate yourself. So you have to live with that sort of ambiguity. Even though Johannesburg now feels like a place on its last legs, I can assure you that there are parts of the city that are coming back to life, right? So you have to live within that. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but is that enough on that?
I'm still going to prod you about, you've now mentioned it, this almost a spectral presence, right, of things that are not quite living, not quite dead, and always in flux. Right. Do you find this, I mean, you've kind of answered the question, but a kind of a productive discomfort, right? The fact that you're always quite out of place, but that's a good thing, right? Not necessarily a bad thing.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think a bit of discomfort goes a long way. I'm sure people who travel, people who write, go to foreign countries and write about them. Part of it is to get out of your comfort zone, as they say. And so much of our lives is dedicated to making ourselves comfortable and not confronting the difficult stuff. And so I think that being made uncomfortable can be very productive, maybe if you're a writer, especially if you're making something of it, because that's always the return, right? If you're simply going through your life miserable and being discomforted all the time, that's not great. But if you have the privilege of making something of your experience, then being uncomfortable and can be a very good thing.
Johannesburg is probably one of the most places where you feel most alive in the world, right? Because you're so challenged and you have to respond to your environment. Justin?
Can I just respond to that? I was thinking on my way here this evening about the similarities and differences between our two books, and I kind of think we've written two completely opposite books in some respects about place. And in a sense, you are maybe celebrating the flux and change. Certainly, your writing is energized by the flux and change of Johannesburg, and there's a vibrancy that comes through in the writing, and you're responding to this. My book is about the opposite. It's about finding places that are not changing and timeless. And I often think of Stephen Watson saying that what he really seeks in life, in terms of where he travels, is places that are not changing and haven't changed and won't change during his lifetime. And so I kind of reject the urban because I find that change and flux, and certainly what happens to the aesthetics, brutalizing in a way. And so I'm looking for getting into nature, and I go to places where I sense that there will be, certainly within my lifetime, as little change as possible.
But isn't it true, though, that I'm not so sure that the books are as different as you say they are. Clearly, the focus on landscape and nature is different. I'm very much a city writer, and the interest I have in nature is very circumscribed and very constrained. The writing that you do about the natural world is very expansive and very affirming kind of writing. But the thing that struck me about your book, there are the places that are not changing, but you also encounter a lot of change.
Yeah.
You encounter a lot of
and
places
resent it.
and resent it.
Yeah.
But the fact is, it's there.
Yeah.
But going back, I was really struck by the places that you go to looking for, in a sense, the world that informed the text, the book that you love, and it's not there anymore. It's been lost to some extent, or it's just changed, and that feeling that you had, there's something that stuck in my head in the Marais section of the chapter, where you said something about how ghosts are very resistant to bad renovation or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you have a beautiful old building and it gets fixed up badly, the ghosts disappear. That I could really relate to that. That feels very much like what I was talking about earlier, the sense of losing the anchoring of the memory in the world.
Yeah.
And I thought there was quite a lot of that in your book.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with your observation, Ivan. I was going to ask you specifically about that sense, right? The contrast very obviously between your books is that it's a landscape-focused book, in contrast to a city-based observation, right? You very much hone in on the particulars of the city. Justin, you go in search of landscapes, but you're not quite sure of what you're going to find, right? And whether the familiar and the beloved and the comforting is actually still going to be there. So my question with that in mind is delving into the not so particularly recent past, with historical figures like Marais, Schreiner, mythical figures connected to specific landscapes. What new can your writing bring to our understanding from a modern perspective of, 2024, 2000s, but looking back, what else can you add to that myth to color it in, to destabilize it, to broaden it, or to create a new myth altogether?
Cool. One of my projects in terms of this text is to encourage other people to go to those places and to celebrate and to go there text in hand and look anew from the perspective of 2024 at a landscape that has been written about in the 1860s or 70s in the case of Schreiner. And I suppose what we spoke about before, I'm really trying to find where the landscape is as close as possible. I'm most happy when I find a landscape that I identify with in the book, in a Jock of the Bushveld or a Homer Charles Bosman. And so I suppose that it's about nostalgia and about...
But Justin, sorry to interrupt, but it isn't a straightforward nostalgia, right? I think that's a very limiting perspective. Ivan, I read in a review when someone said that you were profoundly hunkering for the past Joburg, and I profoundly disagreed with that. I thought there was a misreading, right? Because it's not a straightforward nostalgia. That's not unproblematic. So Justin, this idea of looking back, right? If it's not a nostalgia, if that nostalgia, that perfect place, that utopia, doesn't exist anymore, what does exist, and what do you encounter?
So it is it is a kind of damaged nostalgia. So in some of the cases, I obviously don't find what I'm looking for. But there is, the nostalgia does remain. It is still there, and it runs through the whole text. And there's a lot of sadness in this book. It's set up as a love letter to South Africa, but there's a lot of grief in this book.
It's a love letter with lots of heartbreak. Really.
There's a lot of
Grief,
heartbreak.
right?
Yeah. And that some of the grief is around the fact that some of these places have been lost or damaged or destroyed, and some of the grief is about the path of South Africa, particularly post in the Zuma and post years. And I do set up the two poles of this book, and they were set up for me by my two sort of mentors at UCT in the 1990s, and that is Stephen Watson and J.M. Coetzee. J.M. Coetzee opts to emigrate, Stephen Watson opts to stay. And during the mid-90s at UCT, these were two leading lights, and it was interesting to see what they thought about South Africa at that point. So I've set those two poles up in this book as the emigration pole and the stay and embrace and look for the beauty. And we can go into the whole idea of beauty and so on. But yeah, so there is, and for Coetzee, you know, in a sense, he's a tragic figure. He comes back to South Africa all the time from Adelaide, and he can never quite let go of Voorfontein, the family farm. He can't go back to the farm because he says that would hurt too much. But he keeps coming back to the Karoo as a kind of a migrant. Yeah, so there's definitely sadness and nostalgia, come depression, come despair is there too. But then the love still has to be there because the beauty is still there.
Yeah, and that profound sense of feeling that you have, right? Because it's an attachment to landscape. I think you can't really write about South Africa without being attached to this place, right? There's something about it that's magical, that's warped, that's strange, that's broken, but it's our place, right? I want to ask you in the spirit of place, as being something that unsettles us, but in a productive way. One of the texts that you cover is the Coetzee Michael K. One of my favorites. I think it's an absolutely magnificent book. It really stands the test of time. And that is a book about survival. So my question is for both of you. Do you in any way want your readers to find a kind of a roadmap, small, intimate, provisional as it might be, about how to live in a productive way, like Michael K does, right? Think of that image of him with the teaspoon at the end of that book. Are you writing a tiny little manifesto about how to find hope in lost places?
Yes, I definitely think that's one of the takeaways, if you want to call it that, from Place, is that I do talk about the idea of patriotism and how it has been so tarnished and sullied of late, and how a way to live in this country is local patriotism, to be patriotic about your river or your mountain or your village or your small community or a piece of a park or a kloof in the Cederberg, and that's a way to invest and to express your love, because the big entity of South Africa in 2024 leading up to an election is ugly. You know, it's not a pretty picture. And so yes, that local, and what Michael K teaches us is off-grid, localized, silent, rural.
Shopping trolley could be useful.
Shopping trolley, agrarian, non-meat eating. I mean, he is this little man that is like a seed that is waiting to germinate in some future utopia. But in the meantime, he can get by with frugality. And if we think of Eskom and the kind of stuff we have to, we're all turning inwards and putting solar panels on roofs. We all got our little teaspoon that we're dipping into the well, and the places we go are being curtailed by crime, etc., etc. But we can make a little world for ourselves, like Michael K does, and perhaps there's the hope, and there's the parable for living in South Africa. And I have no convictions about staying or going. I know that if I stay, and I probably will stay, and I am staying, that's how you do it. You don't think big, you think really small, I think.
Yeah, I relate to that. I think the notion that we can solve the big problems with big solutions is actually problematic. And my sense is that, thinking this through, my sense is that it's the small things that are working. There's one of the central things in my book is a story about a friend of mine who makes a garden in a very unlikely place in Kensington on the top of a kopje where there was once a house that was demolished 30 years ago, and on this abandoned plot he and a couple of other people decided to go and make a garden there. And the project was to make a pleasant space for the neighborhood and to try and replant that area and plant it with indigenous plants so that it could integrate a little into the landscape there, but also to keep the the ruins and keep the slightly derelict quality of the place. My friend, always says that ruins are relatively scarce in Johannesburg, so you have to look after them. so they had this project to recover this off their own bat, not a city parks project, just a group of people, creating a more pleasant environment. And of course, being Johannesburg, not being out in the Cederberg or in a beautiful area like that, being Johannesburg, it comes with problems. There are people there that you have to negotiate with. There's the problems of the city, permeate that space as well. But certainly the principle, I think, yes, look to the local and look to the neighborhood and so on, and try and make a pleasant environment for yourself and the people around you.
Yeah. You've now spoken in this quest to make something pleasant about the idea of living amidst ruins and remnants and things that have survived vestiges of time. That brings me to my next question of literary influence, right? Because both of you have written books that have very much, in a very very strong way, have to do with other people's writing and how you incorporate that and build that and turn that into a story of your own. Ivan, I want to ask you about your influences as a writer and your process. You often quote a lot in this book, and they're very, very apt and interesting and engaging quotes. Do you start with an idea and then find supporting material, or do you sort of dig and rummage around and come across a quote and then that sparks a whole conversation?
It happens in different ways. Sometimes I'm working with a quotation or working with a text of another writer that I'd like to say something about. I think the writers that matter to me are, and there are many of them, are kind of present in the way when I'm working, so I don't have to go looking for them in a sense. And they have different, I suppose, they're placed in different ways in relation to this project. I think I was trying to, and I realized this in retrospect, it's not something that I had a plan for, but I was trying in some way to also walk through my literary background, if you like.
Yeah. And so that to me is a lovely facet of the book, which you're actually doing that, right?
Yeah, to try and find the kind of congruence between the themes of the book and the other walking around the city, and also to take a wander through some of the writing that's mattered to me. It's a clear overlap with what you're doing. And those writers are, I think they're quite a mixed bag. Some of them are people that matter to me as mentors or writers who influenced me, and there's a nice connection with Bosman there, because Lionel Abrams is a writer that means a lot to me, and he was Bosman's editor, and he was Bosman's student, so he learned a lot of his writing from Bosman. His parents hired a writing tutor, and his own career was so caught up with Bosman, and when I moved into Lionel's orbit, he brought Bosman very close to me. And what's interesting about that, it was partly the Bosman of the America, but it was also the Bosman of Johannesburg. And that's for me is an interesting thing, that Bosman wrote a lot about the city, but his reputation rests now almost entirely on the writing about the countryside. So there are those kind of writers, and then there are writers that are, I guess they're there because they influence the way of assembling a book, or way of writing, or a way of putting, a way of finding a form for a book, and that's the writers like Galliano, Eduardo Galliano, or John Berger, George Perec. They're, I suppose, as a kind of a guide to reading the book, a guide to how I construct books and how I like to read.
But those two authors are lovely breadcrumbs, if you want, for a sort of politics or a way of looking, right? In terms of interpreting what you're doing or what you're not doing. And you don't want to circumscribe that too much, right? You want to leave it open. Justin, the literary ghosts and shadows that you had to navigate with this book, right? I'm thinking of just a story like Story of an African Tom. It is so big, there are so many myths about Shrine and about that book in particular. When you're writing, not only travel writing, but you're also writing a kind of interpretation, a personal sort of love letter, if you will, about the novels that you're interrogating. How do you balance that? I mean, it's not like you can just go out and say, these critics have said this about this book, and I've now visited this place, and I'm now writing 9 essays. So how, in the form of 9 essays, do you offer something that is continuously meaningful, interesting, varied, and that you capture something of that variation that we have in the landscape, because it's quite unlike any other place in the world, really, with all these worlds in one.
Yeah, I trained as an academic, and I did some of the hard yards in master's and doctoral theses of sitting in libraries for years and doing a hell of a lot of research.
Because your literary analysis in this book is very, very strong. It's really impressive.
Thank you. The one thing I didn't want to end up being an academic, and so the compromise was moving into travel writing. But that whole reflex of making sure you cover all your ground is there. And so before I visited these landscapes, I would often go and do all the reading, as though I were writing a thesis. So I would go and try and read everything by the author, and then as much as I could stomach of all the critical works. Enough to give me a really solid grounding before I went into that landscape. But then I didn't want it to become stodgy and academic, so I then had a bedrock of academic material to dip into if I needed it. But then I wanted my own interpretation of the work and of the landscape.
Did any of the books, the rereading, did it sort of re-inform the way that you used to look at them? Like a beloved novel that you reread and thought, okay, but this is not what I thought it was.
Yeah, because in some cases it was 30 or 40 years since I read it the first time, and it was a completely different experience. For instance, Jock of the Bushveld. I mean, as a kid, a wonderful adventure story. I read it now and I kind of cringe of it because it's a white colonialist going around shooting animals. It's a slaughterhouse. The book with a beloved dog who is a representative of the imperial conqueror. So both Jock and his lord, Sir Percy Fitzpatrick, are these imperial figures striding through the unpeopled Lowveld. So highly problematic. But I wanted to still go back to my childhood enthusiasm, so I wanted to capture that. And so the critical reading and the academic stuff gives me a modern take on it, but I didn't want to lose the passion of the childhood reading. And so it was a kind of a balance. Wherever there was a decision to be made between going more academic or more embracing and travel writerly, I always went for embracing and travel writerly because I wanted it to be a very readable book, and I didn't want to get bogged down in any of the academic debates. So where they do arise in the book, I keep it light, and I don't delve too far. But it's there underneath the text.
I think both of your books, yeah.
I just wanted to say that one of the things I found moving about your book and really fascinating was this taking of the texts into those spaces as a way of almost trying to activate a relationship with the writers. And the moments, there are many moments where it feels like it's working. It feels there's like a congruence between the reading and the space, and the writer feels like the writer's there, and so on. And there are a few moments, and again it was in the Murray chapter, and then in the Stephen Watson chapter, where where the attempt to invoke the writer doesn't, it isn't answered in a way.
Yeah.
The space doesn't reply, and I found that really very kind of touching and very interesting.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree with that. There is very much I don't want to call it a spiritual feel, but there is a sense that you're communicating sort of a higher level and that you're on this search without clear answers. The idea of home for both of you, how do you write about home in a sense that makes us relook what we know as comforting and familiar? Because home isn't necessarily always a homely place. It can be profoundly unsettling. And how do you see home as a kind of a safe place, but also a place where you can be haunted and unsettled? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, home is a tricky one, and I do try and address some of the ideas about home in the book. And the more I think about home, the more I think about it less as a place and more as childhood, that is the home from which you are forever exiled. And I try to capture it in the very first chapter, traveling through Greece, age 6, with my family, going around the islands of Santorini and Patmos, with my big brother and my big sister and my parents, staying in little Greek cottages, 1973, swimming in translucent water, eating dolmades and kleftico, listening to Greek music in a taverna at night. 3 months, sort of July, August, September 1973. That's home for me. And I'll never get back there. Of course I'll never get back there. I'll probably never go back to Santorini. Like Kutsia never wants to go back to Voorfontein Farm. I never want to go back to Santorini. There's a home space. Yeah, so in one sense for me, home is childhood. And I think for many of these writers, in fact all of these writers, each of these texts that I deal with are them engaging with a place very early in life. Olive Schreiner, she's 16 years old on that farm. Stephen Watson, 6 years old in the Cedarburg. J.M. Kutsia goes to Voorfontein at the age of 4. These are seminal moments of engaging with the landscape. Herman Charles Bosman goes to teach at that little school in America for 6 months when he's 20. It's his first job. He doesn't go back for like 25 years. But the indelible impression is there. So those are all kind of homes for them. And if I think of home in more geographical terms, for me, I'm a Cape Town person, so my homes are the family beach house at Simonstown and Church Haven on the west coast. Those are timeless spaces that also stretch back to my childhood. So again, it's the childhood thing that comes in. That's home for me. Whether it's a memory or whether it's geography, it ends up being something about childhood.
And I think that for me it's partly about the writing itself is some establishment of home. I think coming to terms with the feeling of displacement somehow. There's I don't like to quote myself, but there's a section in the book where I describe going to a bar in Hillbrow when I was quite young, walking around in Hillbrow and ending up in a very rough bar where people like myself are not supposed to be, and having the sense of feeling entirely at home and yet out of place. And I think those things are quite compatible. You can feel that you're not supposed to be there, but you can feel at home there, even in that, perhaps in that sort of tension of wrestling to make yourself at home. Svante Mofokeng said something which I actually meant to use as an epigraph in this book, and then I didn't use it in the end. And he said something like that home is a fiction that we create to make ourselves feel better, something like that. And he was someone that I knew and had connection with, and I don't think that's entirely true. I think it's not a fiction, but it's a relationship that we construct somehow, and it rests on memory, and it rests on those feelings of the comfort that comes from having a long history with the place and so on. But I didn't grow up in Johannesburg. I came to Johannesburg when as a student, so I've had to make my home in Johannesburg, as I think many people have. And so yeah, it's an ongoing project to feel at home.
I think that's a really lovely soundbite. This idea of feeling at home. A question for both of you about the question of truth and writing that feels real and that captures that elusive kernel of truth. That you know it when you read it, when you write it. Do you feel that a good writer necessarily has to have some part of him that's an outsider or a bit of an exile figure, someone who writes from the outside looking in? Do you think there's a sense of distance from the subjects that you observe that you need to be a good writer, or do you think you need to be immersed? And how do you feel about that?
I think it cuts both ways, doesn't it? I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about, my friend Chris van Wyk, who wrote books about River Lee in Johannesburg, who was completely embedded in his community. An outsider only in the sense that he made himself into a writer, but in every other way, completely part of his neighborhood, part of his community, still seeing the people he went to school with, and out of that produced extraordinary writing. So I think it's quite possible to write from that position. I guess a lot of contemporary writers, a lot of us are displaced. A lot of people are writing about societies they didn't even grow up in. There's a lot of movement and a lot of distance in that way, and yet it's another way of writing. The question of is it true or not doesn't really enter into it for me that much.
Yeah, I think both hold true. I think most writers are dissidents, or they're sitting outside, just by the nature of what we do, and by the nature of what we need to do. And what we need to do is defamiliarize in order to write stuff in a creative, interesting way. So we need to try and be looking at things with fresh eyes, and that always means a kind of a displacement, a rethinking and a reimagining. Having said that, being a travel writer, almost one of the most important things that I need to do is to try and get under the skin of a place which is complete immersion, trying to look at every single day's little detail, and embrace as much as you possibly can. So that's almost pulling slightly in the other direction. So again, as Ivan said, it's actually a bit of both. Being inside, completely inside, but also being able to step right outside and try to look at it in a fresh way.
Yeah. A question of form then from that. Both of you are non-fiction writers, but you're both novelists as well. And you've written various kinds of modes of writing. Is there any one in particular that you find particularly comforting or homely, and that's kind of a default? And you have to push yourself, like, oh no, this is too easy. I need to push myself a little bit more. Or is there one mode in particular that you find an ongoing challenge and that pushes you to produce new insights?
I've always found writing incredibly difficult. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. And after 25 years as a travel writer, that's probably the one that now, after 25 years of experience, is the one that comes easiest, it's the one that almost flows, whereas all the others seem really tough.
Are you a very pedantic writer? Do you go back and obsessively sort of weigh the words?
In the editing process, I write quite fast initially and quite rough and bitty. So I'll write bits from the beginning, middle, and end. But the editing is very long, slow, and that's where I get more pedantic. I don't think I'm as pedantic as Ivan.
Ivan is an editor as well.
I'm not pedantic at all.
Liar. I think travel writing, the kind of open road place, me in a car with a notebook and a camera, and Brygrid in the back, and Boerewors in the back, and a surfboard in the back. open road, 2, 3, 4 weeks, to the Kalahari, to the Cedarburg. That's where I write the freest and probably the best that I write. Novels, which I'm doing now, I find much harder and much more of a slog. And my novels, being historical novels, have to be so densely researched. You have to get every single thing right for 1941, Simonstown, July. What does the train look like? What is what cigarette are people smoking? What is the music of that month? Which movie are they seeing in the Criterion Cinema in Simonstown in July 1940? So it's a much slower, more grinding process. So yeah, travel writing is the easiest.
I am pedantic.
I know.
Well, let me say I have a pedantic streak, but I try and keep it in check. Yeah, I find when I began writing, I found fiction much easier. In fact, I never imagined that I would write non-fiction at all. I edited a lot of non-fiction, and I partly did that because I wanted the fiction to be in a special category. And I thought when I started out as a writer that fiction offered you incredible freedom to invent and so on. And I began writing non-fiction more or less by accident, and that was around the period of Portrait of Keys when my editing work and my work with photographers and so on took me into that space. And then I felt that I couldn't write fiction in certain contexts, and so I began doing something that was more documentary, which is still how I think about this kind of writing. And I think what's happened is that over the years, the hard and fast distinction between the two has slowly crumbled for me. And it's not a question of anything goes in the work that's documentary or non-fiction. It's more just that the actual way the books are written no longer feels that different to me. It feels like they've converged, just in my own writing, actually.
Sorry, don't you think it was there all along? Because the Restless Supermarket doesn't feel very far from the near north.
Right.
It almost seems like you're coming from a similar place, and the distinction there between the fiction and the non-fiction for me is not that great. I think you've always kept the two very close together, whether you intended to or not.
Yeah, I think that's true. I suppose it's that sense that when you, as a young writer, I made big claims for the imagination. I was making everything up. You feel that you're inventing worlds and coming up with new things. And actually, in retrospect, a lot of the work that was published in my early collections, story collections, was actually based on research. It was me walking around doing what I'm doing now, but presenting this as non-fiction. So you're right that the distinction was probably never really that fixed.
That's an entire session on its own. That question of genre and boxes and how we read and interpret. I'm in the near north. It being many different things, right? It's not just one thing. You've got the 5 sections, but you do leave it up to the reader to make a lot of judgments and discernments, and it's not a book that really goes out to spell things out and tell people how to feel. But it is incredibly personal. The landscapes of loss that you traverse in this book, very tenderly handled, often lyrical, but just acutely painful, but almost quite beautiful in its delicacy and fragility. You're one of those writers that can really in 3, 4, 5 sentences just tell an entire story that it really it makes your heart want to stop. You know, it's something of rare beauty and imagination. When you delve very deeply into stories that are personal for you, how do you really go about capturing that spirit of a person or a place, of an object? Because you also write about objects, right? They mean something to you. How do you write about things that have a meaning to you? And is it different than just observing a tree being cut down, or nails, or a vagrant passing or something? Is there a difference?
Yeah, well, thank you for the comments about the writing. I appreciate. I think some of the very personal material in this book was difficult to write. I think it's some of the most difficult writing that I've done from the point of view of not wanting to do it. One of the ways that I've coped with that is actually just not rushing into the text. So some of the pieces that I think you're referring to I've been sitting with them for a very long time and finding the right moment to write about those things. And then it's a case of trying to do it with a little bit of trying to do it as well as one can, which means with intention, with focus, with trying to, and with feeling.
Also with a lot of humor, right? It's not a humorless book. It's actually very wry and very funny in places.
Yeah, I think that's been my experience. It's some of the most difficult moments of my life have provoked laughter. I think that's a human thing, and sometimes things that we laugh at turn out to be very painful. Either in the moment or we're laughing because of that, or in retrospect they turn out to be painful things. And so yeah, I think one should. It's a way of processing. I think it's a great privilege actually to be able to deal with the difficulties in your experience in writing. I mean, and to deal with the joyful things too, the celebratory things too. It's a way of processing. I'm not sure that I can answer how I do it. I do it as well as I can.
Justin, my question for you with these essays, it's not like there's a lack of quality in any of them. They're all excellent. They're particularly polished, well-honed, convincing, engaging. Even on a reread, right, you find some other insight that can keep you thinking and going for days. Was there one landscape, or maybe a couple in this book, that you felt compelled in an almost otherworldly way to write about? Right? I mean, there are places that you love and that are easy and that you find comforting, but was there a place, maybe the Karoo, for instance, or the landscapes connected to Stephen Watson, very personal, that you felt a real investment in writing about?
Yes, and you're correct. It is the Stephen Watson chapter of the Cederberg that touched me and was the one that I felt closest to and felt most passionate about. And that's for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that Stephen Watson was taken to the Cederberg when he was 6 years old by his father to walk the Middelburg track. And I was taken to the Cederberg at a similar period, at a similar age, just after I'd been to Greece with my parents. And we'd been on Santorini and Patmos, as I mentioned. And we came to this little village in the center of the Cederberg, Wuppertal, and it was a whitewashed village with donkeys and goats and a chiming bell and a little stream and the smell of fragrant sort of fynbos. And I thought, I'm 7 years old and I'm thinking I've gone straight back to Greece. What's going on here? And there was an immediate passionate engagement. So that's where some of my love of the Cederberg started at the same sort of time that it did for Stephen. Then Stephen was also kind of a mentor for me when I was a student, and then afterwards as a writer. He was incredibly encouraging and helped me through my early terrible writing attempts. And then he died tragically in 2011 of cancer, young, and part of writing this book was about writing about Stephen. I mean, that was one of the anchor texts, that and Michael Kay. It took me 10 years to pluck up the courage to go and walk those tracks. So just before he died, I wrote him an email and I said, Stephen, this is the project. I'm going to write a number of texts. And he wrote back and he told me exactly the paths to walk to go and engage with his Cederberg. And it took me 10 years to pluck up the courage because I knew it was going to be an emotional journey. So I went back to the Cederberg, hired a hut, took all his books with me, and went and walked those trails with his poems in my backpack and read them on location at the points where he wrote them, or at points that he wrote about. And so, yeah, if there's one landscape in the book, it's the Cederberg, and it also happens to be the one that I'm also most emotionally engaged with, being from the Western Cape, and the quality of light and texture and fynbos and and the old world, the sand world. It all comes together for me in that landscape.
You've really spoken very beautifully about your relationship with Stephen and the writing. I want to pose two more questions to you. The first one is about landscape, place, and memory, and how you navigate that as a writer, because memory by nature is ephemeral, right? It disappears, it's something fleeting. It's not something you just can always remember perfectly. So the first question is about capturing impressions, right, in writing, and how you go about doing that and honing it. Then the second question has to do with the writing itself that you find most expressive and most enjoyable, the kind of literary influence that you have, or kind of writing that you would not like to replicate, right? You try to do something different.
Okay, as to the first question, those early childhood memories for me, 6 years old, 7 years old, whether it's Greece or the Cederberg, they are very hazy, obviously. And fortunately, my father took photographs everywhere we went. So the old family photo album is amazing. To see a picture of me on Santorini in 1973, it triggers all sorts of stuff. Now, whether what is triggering are true memories, or they're family folklore, or they're stuff I've made up, I'm not sure.
But those are interesting things, right? That
it doesn't matter. Yeah, it could all be fake. It could all just be from the family from the family stories. It doesn't matter. They've become the memories, and of course they've mutated over time. Same with the Cederberg. The first impressions I have of Wuppertal are from about that age, and they've been overlaid by so many trips over the last 40, 50 years that I have no idea whether those first memories are real, or they're from when I was 8 or 9 years old, or again, it doesn't matter. It's the emotions that I need to try and convey, and the photographs are very helpful. And your second part of your question, literary influences. Strangely, a bit like Ivan, I'm an absolute fan of Robert Macfarlane, he's my favorite living travel writer, and I go back to him again and again. And I think a lot of what Ivan does is quite similar. Again, Macfarlane is mostly in very rural landscapes, and Ivan is very much city, although Macfarlane also delves into the underworld of Paris and so on. But my guru golden writer is Macfarlane, and I could never write like that. It's beautiful and lyrical and beautifully researched. It's poetry. It's poetry in prose form. And another favorite writer for me in that kind of travel meets fiction is Sebald, W.G. Sebald.
Isn't he just incredible?
Incredible. And I don't know if it's fiction or non-fiction or where it sits precisely, particularly something like Austerlitz. Where does it sit exactly? For me, his most travel writerly book is Rings of Saturn, and I go back to that again and again. And when I teach travel writing at UCT, it's that text, because it's him walking through the East Anglia landscape and around Norfolk and so on, and engaging with the history of civilization on a train ride to Suffolk. You know, it's just breathtakingly beautiful. So,
and it's a very strange book, right? His writing is strange.
Yeah. And I'm not strange. I play it absolutely straight. So I could never be a Sebaldian, and I could never be a Macfarlane. But those are, in terms of travel writing and the blurring between travel writing and fiction, those would be my lodestars, I would say.
And for you, Ivan, the link between landscape and memory, first of all?
Yeah, I think the notion that appeals to me is the one that memories are somehow caught in place. Right? That somehow, if you they anchor, your memories are anchored by physical places, and I think it's a very well recognized notion that we locate memories in that way, and therefore, if you spend your life in a place that's erasing the physical cityscape, say, all the time, the memories are going with them. And I think that's something that connects many South Africans for different reasons. Right? so many people have been displaced from the spaces in which their memories were embedded, where the containers of memory have been obliterated. So I think that's one aspect of it. I've had the feeling that McFarlane captures so well of have this sense that things are present in certain spaces, that people are present, and it's not a mystical idea. I think it's partly the triggering of memory, but it's also the sense that we've been talking about. If you take these ideas seriously, that people are connected to place, and it does feel that there's a spirit there. There's some kind of spirit of them in a place. Literary influences, it's, I think it varies according to it's certainly changed over time, and it varies according to the kind of book. But I think for a book like this one, some of the writers I've mentioned are probably the key ones, and that's Georges Perec, for instance. And you asked, what are the writers that you avoid because you're concerned about influence, and he would be right, close to the top of the list, because he was so obsessive about observation and about recording.
And Berger, of course, very much.
Yeah, and Berger, I think more as a kind of formal influence, but in terms of the city writing, there's a whole set of writers who, Joyce is in there. But also John Dos Passos, for instance, was a writer that I read at a very important time in my own development as a writer, who wrote that huge trilogy called USA, which is a Manhattan Transfer, and books that really captured city life. So those writers are important, but I think in relation to this book, I would say Perec is probably the key influence that I would have to make sure I don't write like Perec. Try to avoid it anyway.
Yeah. I think you inevitably capture something of their spirits in the way that you write, because it's such a direct influence. We're going to open up the floor for a couple of questions, just maybe one or two or three, but as a last comment, both of you have written truly memorable and really, really wonderful books. Ivan, I think your book is a highlight in your oeuvre of many different highlights. You've been playful, you've been serious, you've been deep, thoughtful, you've been humorous, you've been everything under the sun. But this book manages to distill the essence of a Vladislavić text, which is that it is immediately recognizable as your work. And I think that's wonderful. Justin, I think your book place is one of those that I'm going to keep on my desk or my nightstand, or at the very least on my bookshelf, and return to it time and time again. You've written incredibly beautifully and poignantly and in such an intimate way about landscapes that I think you've made a real contribution to landscape writing, travel writing, and to the literary scene. I mean, I'm not surprised that it's been reprinted 6 times now, which is a remarkable feat. I think you've both done incredibly well. And I'd really like to thank both of you for agreeing to this conversation. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Questions from the audience? I'm sure there's something that someone would like to ask. Do you need the mic? Yes.
No, I think, is this okay? No. Yeah. My question is to Ivan. I've been, since I've read your book, which I love, and it was deeply personal, been thinking about asking you this question. But in some ways it's a reflection, it's more about my reflection on my experience of the book, and I'm going to ask the question anyway, is that when you are writing, are you thinking about how the reader is going to experience what you're writing? And and I ask it because, for those of you who've read it, there's a section where Ivan describes in detail going down Osborne Street into Hope, winding up Sylvia's past, and it's extraordinary detail. And there's a part of me that's thinking, did he think we were going to follow him all this way? And at that moment, you say to the reader, just stay with me for a while, just for a second. I was really struck by that. And I guess the reason the book has been important for me is I've lived in Joburg for more than 45 years and just dislocated here, Cape Town, about 2 years ago. And all of us always lived in the inner city. So Bears Valley, Orange Grove, Berea, and left Joburg from Yogo after 35 years there. So Joburg is home for me. So reading the detail was incredibly powerful and meaningful for me. But I thought, someone who doesn't know Joburg, someone who doesn't hang out in that area, what will you, when you say that to the reader, just stay with me for, just hang in there. It's like it's going to get good, or it's hell of a detail, but just, the kind of, what's it, the jewel is there on the top of the hill. I was just really struck by that kind of section. And what is your thinking when you're writing? Are you thinking about what the reader is going to be doing?
Thanks for that comment. It's really interesting. I was just part of a panel at Franschhoek on the reader and whether or not the writers think about the reader. Is there an ideal reader? Or do you think about the reader when you're writing? And the consensus was no. But of course, that's it's probably just the answer that gets you out of a corner. Yeah, I think it's difficult to talk about. I find it difficult to talk about this question because on the one hand, one is thinking about the reception. You're trying to communicate, so that is in the back of your mind. And at the same time, I don't have a sense that I'm writing for somebody. The relationship, it feels to me, and this might be a fiction, but it feels to me like the relationship is with the text. I'm trying to resolve something between myself and the text. But yeah, I think in that particular the passage that you've mentioned, I think it's clear that that I'm aware, I've become aware as I'm writing that passage that this is too much to ask because it's very detailed. And that section of the book was actually published in a journal before it appeared in the book. And the editor of the journal, who I really respected, did say to me, this is just too far. You have to pull this back a bit. And so I cut it back, but I tried to cut it back. I didn't want to lose that effect, which is we're going to go there. We're going to go from my house all the way out down to Bruma, and we're going to go turn by turn and street by street. And so I didn't want to lose that effect. And so I built into it a kind of an apology in a way, saying, okay, I know you're about to get bored and you're about to just jump to the end of this, but just stay with it because we're going somewhere. So in that particular case, I was really thinking about the reader. And in another way, you think about the reader all the time. You keep when you step back into that editing mode, you're looking at the text and saying, well, what will someone make of this? Does this feel right? Is the connection between these parts sensible? And so that is there, but I think not in the way that the text is being made for that reader. It's rather some sense that there's a context into which it will go and people have to have something to work with.
Sorry, I have a frog in my throat, but I'll do my best. So I'm interested in how you both go out into the world and how you handle fear, because I'm a very anxious person. I found, even at a fairly young age, that I'm becoming a little bit reclusive lately because of the fact that there's so much going on in the world. It can be a scary place. I'm wondering how often you
Yeah, as a travel journalist, I've got myself into sticky situations quite often, more so in my younger years, but I try now to avoid it. The thing to do is not to write an urban novel like Ivan does. Is to keep it rural.
And then you run into a handsome stranger and boom, you're done.
Yeah. So yeah, it's always a problem at the back of your mind. But as I say, I do a lot of very rural stuff. So if I'm off in the Cederberg or the Kruger Park or the Mariko, I feel mostly relatively safe. Yeah, it's when I get to the cities, like tomorrow I'm going to Joburg and hiring a car, driving through Joburg. That's when you have to put your armour on much more. So I don't, yeah, it doesn't, given what I write and the way I write it and where I write it and where I'm researching, I don't face that problem so much. But Ivan does, walking the streets of Johannesburg.
Sure, that comes with the territory, as they say. How does one cope? I think you have to. Well, like Justin, I was much more of a risk taker in this respect when I was younger, and I did it quite determinedly to go into areas and say, I belong here, I'll go here. You can't tell me not to walk here. I'm going to walk around, and I got into bad situations, and so I've become more careful. And I think as you get older, you tend to become more cautious anyway. And then I think there are sort of strategies that just have to do with being sensible about where you are, which people confront in every city. Johannesburg feels like maybe it's more dangerous in some ways, but you have, if you know what you're doing, you just take care. You don't go and walk in a neighborhood that feels risky to walk in, and so on. It's very constraining. I mean, I find this deeply troubling, and it's a source of ongoing real irritation to me, and sometimes even anger, that our lives are constrained in this way. It's such a great pleasure to walk in the city at night, for instance. When I travel, one of the things that's always a relief is going somewhere where you can walk around at night. And you can't do that in Johannesburg. I mean, nobody does it. It doesn't matter where they are in the city. It's not got to do with your class position or anything like that. People just can't do it. They have to be incredibly careful. And that's just a real imposition on the freedoms that we should have as citizens to move around. And what else? I think that's it. I mean, I've just learned to be a bit more careful. I adopt what Mark Visser in his Lost and Found in Johannesburg called the attitude of the Joburg person is brisk vigilance, and that helps actually. If you're wandering around looking like you're lost, then you become a target. If you look like you know what you're doing, I think that helps a lot.
And the pace, of course, in Joburg is much quicker than it is in Cape Town. And we do it nice and strong. So,
Right.
Got another question.
I found it extremely interesting listening to you. I was thinking of problems around landscape painting and painting cityscapes. And what became clear in your talking is you're so aware of how mediated your access to whatever you're describing as the city or the countryside or whatever. And the naive point of view is, of course, you go out and meet nature as it is and so on. I could go on and on. I want to pose you a question which may be related to this, but maybe not. When you help beginning writers, what are the typical weaknesses of writing, especially about place? Because it's clear you have reflected so deeply on what you're doing if you're writing about place. If you go back to the other side, what do you see? What do you tell people
I think the advice that I'm trying to think this through quickly as you're speaking. I think what young or inexperienced writers tend to do is, and this is a problem of creative writing programs in general, is that they have a sense of how a book gets put together, how it's made, and it's made up of different components. And one of those components is the setting. So they tend to draw very clear lines between character, setting, storyline, and so on. And when I'm giving advice to writers, it's often about collapsing those categories and saying, if you're writing about landscape, or say you're writing, let me stick to my area. If you're writing about the city, it's not as if you have characters doing something and moving around and talking to one another, and they're doing that thing in a special space of character, and they happen to be doing it in a setting, and so that you can put them in a setting. Actually, you have to think of those things together. So you don't. I mean, it's more easily said than done, but you can't compartmentalize in that way. So character is going to emerge from what the character is doing in the space, how they relate to it, how they move through it. The space will emerge not just in the description of the space, but in how the characters are relating to one another, what they're doing, what they're saying, and so on. It's different according to where they are. So I think I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but it's to not think of the physical world as a setting for something else, but to think of those things together.
Yeah, so I've been teaching travel writing at UCT off and on for 20 years, and the characteristic problems of those first drafts of writing is obviously purple prose, people just stacking things with adjectives, thinking that they can bring to bear a particular way of looking at landscape through adjectival or adverbial insistence. The other problem is that they tell the story of their journeys, and that's invariably boring. So if the assignment is to go off to somewhere and write about, let's say, the Cederberg, they come back and they write the story of they went and they met the people, and that's really boring. So I have to try and teach them to lie, and that means break the story up. Don't follow the chronology. Find a theme that really works and just run with that theme and cut everything else out. The other thing I tell people to do is to stop, because it's so easy to, when you travel writing, just to keep moving and jot it all down and get the linear chronology. But often the best writing comes from stopping and taking time out, take an afternoon out, sit quietly alone and just let the landscape or the environment talk to you, and just do brainstorm, just flow consciousness, whatever comes to mind, the sights, smells, sounds. In other words, use all the techniques of a fiction writer, a storyteller. Don't stick to the facts, because you need to be true to the story you want to tell about that landscape in order to keep your reader interested. So you're using the facts of your journey or your trip merely as raw material to write something that is true to the spirit of the truth, but maybe not necessarily to the journey that you did. No one takes that further than Bruce Chatwin, who effectively writes a novel when he's writing a piece of travel writing. But it's utterly compelling, and he often does use facts that were in fact true, but not always. And as a travel writer, you need to strike that balance, and it's often leaning more towards the techniques of a fiction writer or a short story writer than it is to recording the facts. In other words, it leans quite far away from journalism and more into the techniques of fiction writing.
So never let a good fact get in the way of a good story, right?
I say, that's the one. Yeah.
If I could, what you're talking about, stop. That sounds that's such good advice, because I mean that's to go back to Perek, who I was talking about earlier. That was his great genius, was to be able to be still in one place and just observe what's happening. So he has this wonderful text called An Attempt at Exhausting a Place in Paris, where he went and sat in a cafe and just looked at what was happening in the street outside and wrote it all down. And not in a narrative way, actually, just making a long list, sitting there for 3.5 days, just making a list of what he saw out of the window. And what I love about what emerges from that is the impossibility, first of all, of sustaining that attention, because your attention is always wandering. The impossibility of actually capturing everything, because it's just not possible. That would be diabolical writing if you could do that. So it's very partial. It's like what's attracting his attention. And then the impossibility of keeping out of the writing like that, the persona of the writer. So you can take this list of what he saw from the window, which appears to be just kind of fairly neutral, dispassionate observation, and find traces of the writer in it. And I think that's an interesting thing about any kind of descriptive writing, that the character of the observer emerges.
I think that's an absolutely fascinating way to stop. I mean, it's almost like you're starting a part 2 here for the conversation, Ivan. We'll have to get the audience back for that. Thank you. It's been fascinating talking about your craft, your influences, your way of doing things, and I think it's been an altogether marvelous evening. So thank you very much, Justin. Thank you, Ivan. It's been a real pleasure.